Hello everyone, thanks for coming. This is the 4th annual Guelph Lectures in Philosophy series that was established 4 years ago. I'm going to ask Professor Mark McCullough, the Chair of Philosophy Department, to introduce our guest speaker. More volume. How's this now? It's better? Professor McCullough is going to introduce our guest speaker. After that, there will be a reception at Bouldering, and people are welcome to join us there for an hour. That would be so. Professor McCullough.
I'm not the main event. Hi, my name is Mark McCullough. I'm the chair of the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Guelph. Oh, okay. Is there what? I'll just hold my face closer to the microphone. Okay. Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Mark McCullough. I'm the chair of the Philosophy Department. And it's an honor to introduce to you today Professor Tim Scanlon of Harvard University, who has generously agreed to visit us today to talk about the nature of morality. I'll say a few words about Professor Scanlon's accomplishments. In the early part of his academic career, he made contributions to mathematical logic. Then his interests in ethics developed, and he began publishing contributions in that area. Professor Scanlon is best known for the theory that he calls contractualism. Ethics isn't my area, so I'm not going to risk an inaccurate summary of his theory, but I'll try to highlight a couple of notable aspects to Professor Scanlon's approach. One is that a basic question in it is, what sorts of reasons are moral reasons? We usually take them to override reasons of other sorts. But how do they get this amazing feature, that they override reasons of other kinds? And how are these reasons used? What is it to engage in moral discussion? Which sorts of moves does that involve? This fundamental concern with the nature of moral reasons is crucial for Professor Scanlon because of the second notable thing, which is that his theory inverts what you might think is the order of dependence between the facts about morality and the facts about how moral discussion should go. You might think that the facts about morality are what they are, regardless of any discussion of how any discussion of those facts might go. You might admit, though, that ideally moral discussion would converge on these facts. But for Professor Scanlon, the moral facts are what they are because of how the moral discussion would go. It's the discussion, done properly, that makes the facts what they are. So we cannot judge whether the discussion has gone well by seeing whether it has arrived at the right results. We have to judge the discussion in its own terms. Well, that's just a couple of points. Professor Scanlon has set out this view in his well-known book, What We Owe to Each Other, published in 1998. He's published a couple of other books since then, The Difficulty of Tolerance in 2003, and Moral Dimensions, Permissibility, Meaning, Blame in 2008. And in addition to explaining his overall theory, he has intervened in more specific discussions concerning freedom of speech and equality, among others. So we're delighted and grateful that Professor Scanlon agreed to come to Guelph today to give this public talk. I'm sure you'll find it interesting, and please do be ready with questions afterwards, because philosophers always relish the question and answer part of any talk. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Mark. Am I audible? Tell me if I'm. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'll warn those in the audience that they'll hear more about contractualism if they stay, so you might want to leave if you find that uninteresting. It's a great pleasure to be in Guelph. I've been having a very good time for the last day since I've been here. It's a lovely place, beautiful snow, nice people. My being here is a testimony to the internationalization of the academic world. I'm here because I met Omid Pero in a cafe on the campus of Seoul National University in South Korea when we were both attending the World Congress of Philosophy. And we had such a good time talking over lunch with people from several other countries, as I recall, at that table. He said afterward, "You must come to Guelph sometime." And I said, "Oh, sure, that would be nice." But he pursued this, and so here I am, and I'm delighted to be here. So the topic of my talk, what is morality, is a pet question on my mind. I believe that we commonly, in the academic world, in the public press, in political discussion, use the word moral and morality all the time, but we often lack any clear idea of exactly what it is we have in mind or what kind of claim we're making when we use these terms. And so my object in this hour that I'm going to be talking to you is to try to get you to focus your attention on this question as you yourself would use that term, to offer you some alternative interpretations, try to get you to see why I adopt the interpretation that I favor, and to leave you, I hope, at the end of the day, changed in the following way, that in future, when you hear somebody use this word, or you use it yourself, you'll be inclined to stop just a little bit and think a little bit about what it is that you have in mind when you're making that particular claim. So here are just a few examples of why I think that people disagree or have unclear ideas about this. So in philosophy departments, you'll often find a course called moral philosophy or a course called ethics. And if you actually take the courses, you'll see that it doesn't really make much difference whether the course is called moral philosophy or whether it's called ethics. The curriculum and the readings are likely to be pretty much the same. And one of the things that's pretty much guaranteed about the curriculum is that it won't have anything particular to do with sex. That is, according to the idea of morality or ethics that's taught in the course, certain kinds of actions involving sex will come out as moral wrongs. That is, rape, deception, maybe various other kinds of violence involved in sex will be morally wrong. But who's on top, whether it's a man or a woman, whether it's one person or two people or three people, is just not. It's not something that would come up, right? It's not part of the subject. Things are very different in the newspaper. Right? If you read, at least in the United States, and I assume, although I know I'm in a more civilized and sophisticated country today, but I assume it's not so different in this respect. If you read in the newspaper that there's a question about a politician's morals, you know right away what it has to do with, right? And if it's ethics that are mentioned, then it's money, right? So morality has to do with sex, ethics has to do with money, or maybe the exercise of power, right? So sexual harassment is the intersection of morality and ethics on this view. So here's a question. Here we have people who are educated in the same tradition, they live in the same culture, they speak the same language, but they use this word morality in a way that it's not just that they disagree about which things are morally right and which things are morally wrong. They seem in some sense to be talking about a slightly different subject. And that seems rather surprising. Now, there's one thing that's misleading about that way of introducing my topic, because I've introduced this as a kind of pop sociological observation about how to understand what's going on in newspapers and in political speeches as opposed to what's going on in the academy or somewhere else. And my main topic today isn't a descriptive issue in that sense. I'm not interested just in characterizing what different groups of people in our society or other societies mean by the term morality. The question I'm really interested in addressing is not a descriptive question about what people think. Now I'm going to introduce a technical term. It's a normative question. Normative questions, in my way of speaking, are questions about what people have reason to do. All normative questions are questions about reasons. Now, they're not just questions about what reasons people think they have, right? The question about did I have any good reason to come to Guelph? It isn't a question about, did I think I had a good reason to come to Guelph? I might have thought I had no good reason to come to Guelph, but in fact, I was mistaken. I had a very good reason to come to Guelph. I promised Omi that I would come to Guelph, and it was also true that if I came to Guelph, I'd have a great time. So I in fact, had very good reasons to come to Guelph. That's the normative claim, right? Whether I thought I had good reasons, that's just a psychological question about my thinking at the time, which might have been right or wrong, right? So the topic of my lecture today is a normative question about why we should care about this thing we call morality, what its form is. It's not a question about why we think we have, what reason do we think we have, or not. So this tension between descriptive or sociological or psychological questions on the one hand and normative questions on the other is going to keep coming up throughout my talk. And since it's a slightly technical distinction, I'm spending a little bit of time here laying it out for you. Now, we can talk about that more. A lot of people, I think, want to deny that there is such a distinction, and you'd be in good company if you wanted to deny that. I disagree with you, and we can talk about that in the question period if you want to bring it up. I'm not laying down the law that nobody's eligible to ask that question. Well, now let me mention another case where the question of what we mean by moral comes up, and this is in the philosophy of law and thinking about philosophy of law. Some of you may have taken courses in philosophy of law in which you read debates about the relation between morality and law. And one of these debates is about whether it's the fact that an action is immoral is a sufficient reason for making it illegal. For example, whether the fact that certain kinds of sexual conduct are immoral is a sufficient reason for making them illegal. There's been a famous debate in the philosophy of law about that topic, and the liberal position, so to speak, the one that I would favor, holds that the answer to that question is no. The fact that an action would be morally wrong is not a sufficient reason for making it illegal. But on the other hand, liberals like me, like, for example, Professor Ronald Dworkin, who was one of the great legal thinkers of our time, believe that the content of law itself is not independent of morality. So our Constitution, and I think the new Charter of Canada, if I understand it right, contains certain rights that everybody's supposed to have. So rights to due process, not to be imprisoned without a trial. Rights to freedom of speech, not to be prevented by the government from speaking out on political matters or other things. Rights of privacy, not to have your email pried into by not only by the CIA but by whatever the Canadian version of the CIA is. I don't know, the CCIA or what. I don't know what you call it. I hope you don't have one, but I sort of suspect, the way things are, you probably do. So Dworkin claimed, correctly in my view, that if you have a constitution, as we do in the United States, that incorporates things like the right to freedom of speech, the right to privacy, the right to due process, then it follows that a decision about what your constitution allows, which laws are constitutional and which laws are unconstitutional, will in difficult cases at least be at base a moral decision. That in order to decide whether something is permitted by the Constitution, you have to find out whether it's compatible with the moral idea of freedom of speech, which is, as it were, incorporated by reference, as lawyers say, within the Constitution. So what the scope of legitimate law is depends upon a moral question about what the right to free speech, the right to due process, or the right to privacy actually requires. Now that's a controversial view, as is the view that the law shouldn't simply enforce morality, another controversial view, but some people hold, as I and Professor Dworkin, hold both of these controversial views, but it may be if we hold both of those controversial views, then we're engaged in some kind of confusion, because we're on the one hand saying that the law is independent of morality, but on the other hand we're saying what the law is depends upon morality. So we've got to, if we want to get our house in order, we've got to decide ourselves, well, what do we mean by morals when we say the law shouldn't be an enforcer of morals? And what do we mean by morals when we say the interpretation of the Constitution requires a judge or anybody else who wants to decide constitutional matters to make moral judgments about what is morally permissible, what's morally permissible. So here we are in expressing our view about the law using this word, and it looks like we are in some kind of confusion about it. So we need to answer the question of, well, when we use that word, what do we have in mind? And as I say, that's not a psychological question about us or a historical or sociological question. It's a question that reflectively we need to make a decision about. We need to decide, what we really believe we have reason to do. Okay. Now, let me then turn my discussion to this question of how to understand morality. Well, I think it's generally agreed by people who disagree about morality, such as the religious people and the non-religious people I mentioned at the beginning, and also something that I accept myself as a starting point, that whatever morality is, it involves standards of conduct that everybody has good reason to try to adhere to. And to regard as Mark McCullough said in his introduction, to regard as normally overriding other considerations. So the fact that if I reach a conclusion that something is morally wrong, the fact that it would be inconvenient for me not to do it, or the fact that it would be fun to do it, it doesn't count, right? the fact that it would be morally wrong settles the issue, at least in almost all cases. So it's, as Mark indicated in his introduction, it's a puzzling question. So where does morality get off having this powerful kind of authority? What's morality that it should be able to override all these other considerations? And how could so this is really a question about, as people have commonly said, why be moral? What is the reason that backs our concern with morality? Morality is a set of standards that purports to have a certain authority, but why accept those standards? This normative question, this question about what reasons we have, and supposedly what reasons everybody has been a central question of moral philosophy since the beginning. If you go back to Plato, for example, in the course that I teach, my introductory course that a lot of this lecture comes from, I start off by reading a dialogue, one of Plato's dialogues called Gorgias, which is largely about why people should take morality seriously. Now, it's difficult to give the right kind of answer to this question, because an answer to the question faces a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, the answer to the question can't itself be an answer that appeals to morality. When somebody says, why should I do what I'm morally required to do? You can't say, because it would be morally bad of you not to, right? That's a circular an answer, right? So the first horn of the dilemma is you can't be closely tied to morality. The other horn of the dilemma is that the answer can't appeal to things that are too completely disconnected from morality. So if I said, look, the reason you should take the requirements of morality seriously is you're more likely to get rich that way, right? You'll get more customers if you treat your neighbors and friends right. So it's a key to success. That's not the right kind of reason. So the question is how to find an answer to this question, why care about morality, which on the one hand doesn't presuppose morality, on the other hand isn't like a bribe or something like that. Now, one common answer that people sometimes give is that moral requirements are commands of God, right? And in fact, many people, whether they are religious or not, believe that unless there is a God who's issued commandments, there can't really be such thing as morality, because morality purports to be a set of standards that everybody has reason to go by, and unless there's some kind of authority that legislates those and enforces those standards for everybody, then it's up to each of us to decide what standards to take, and there isn't really anything. You couldn't have anything that, as it were, lived up to the pretensions of morality as being universally legislative and authoritative for everybody out there. A lot of people accept that view, whether they are themselves religious or not, right? Some religious people say, look, you've got to be religious because otherwise you've got no morality. So if you think you take morality seriously, but you don't believe in God, you're contradicting yourself. Whereas other people say, yes, there couldn't be any morality without God. There isn't any God, so there's no morality. It's all silly, right? Don't be taken in by this stuff, right? So this idea of no morality without God is a powerful idea out there. So I need, in reflection myself, normatively deciding whether I have a reason to take morality seriously, I need to confront this question of whether morality in some way depends on God. So there's two parts to this question. One is whether the idea that moral requirements are commands of God could be a possible explanation of why we should care about morality. And the second is whether it's the only possible explanation, right, as many people claim. So let's look at that. So the crudest version of this view would be that moral requirements are commands of God, and they're authoritative because they are backed by a convincing threat of divine punishment, right? Why keep your promises? Well, have you thought about what an eternity of torment would really be like, right? So that's a crude version of a so-called divine command theory. This has some advantages. Arguably, it provides everybody with a reason for, it's not culturally relative or something, right? Nobody wants to suffer an eternity of torment, and God, presumably, if there is such a thing, would be in a position to catch all the malfeasors and be sure that they actually suffer this. So it's a pretty convincing threat, and it would apply to everybody. But it doesn't actually pass the test I set, because I said, look, an explanation for why we should care about morality has to, on the one hand, not presuppose morality. Well, so far we're okay with God's all right on that. But also, it can't be something like a bribe. But a threat is, what's a threat? But it's an inverted bribe, right? So if I'm being moral only because I want to avoid divine punishment, I mean, you might think that I haven't really got the concept of what it is for something to be morally wrong. I'm just a coward or whatever, or I'm just influenceable by really big threats. Now, there's another way. I just mentioned this as a side issue that you ought to think about. There's another way, though, in which certainly in the history of philosophy, it's thought that God was important to morality, in that one thing God could do would be to make it the case, at least considering the afterlife as well as this life, that nobody was going to suffer greatly by doing what morality requires, right? So you might think, look, suppose a tyrant says, if you don't give false testimony against this person, we're going to torture you, and not just going to torture you, we're going to imprison and torture your family. Well, that's a pretty tough thing. So why, even if I take morality seriously, do I really have a sufficient reason to do it when there's that cost, right? So one role that God might have would be he would ensure that even though the tyrant might torture us, we would all be deliriously happy in heaven ever afterward. And so there'd be compensation for the costs. And Kant seems to have believed something. I mean, he wouldn't have put it as crudely as that, but he seemed to think that although the authority of morality didn't depend on God, morality, he thought, had a basis in reason, independent of God. Nonetheless, one couldn't rationally accept moral requirements unless one believed that the world was so constructed that you wouldn't really suffer terribly if you lived according to moral requirements. Happiness and morality had to be somehow compatible, and how could that be true but except through the world having been benevolently created, so that these things would be compatible, and that means we believe in a benevolent creator, right? So this sort of compensatory view is got. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I want to give this view of the role that God might have in morality a fair shake by pointing out that it's not simply that God might serve as an enforcer. He might serve as a compensator, right? He might prevent you from being a net loser by doing what's moral. But that would still leave open the question, okay, I'm not going to be a net loser, but so why should I do it? And that's the question we wanted an answer to. So we might look for some other problem, some other solution. But there's also, if you're trying to look at God's commands as providing you with a reason for being moral, there's also the famous Euthyphro problem raised by Plato. In the dialogue called Euthyphro, Socrates meets a young man named Euthyphro who's hurrying through the public square, and Socrates says, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I can't stop to talk now, Socrates. I'm on my way to the assembly to denounce my father." And he said, "Well, what are you going to denounce him for?" And he said, "For impiety. He's been behaving impiously, and so he'll get some severe penalty, but I have to go denounce him." And Socrates says, wait a minute, Euthyphro, we ought to have a talk about this. So what is impiety? Euthyphro says, well, pious acts are acts that are loved by the gods, and impious acts are ones that aren't pious. And then Socrates asked one of the most famous questions in the history of philosophy, which has been known as the Euthyphro question. Well, tell me, Euthyphro, he said, are pious acts loved by the gods because they're pious? Or are they pious because they're loved by the gods? And this stops poor Euthyphro in his tracks, and the dialogue kind of goes on from there. But it's stopped a lot of philosophy in its tracks ever since, because anytime you want to define some concept as being, something falls under this concept if we would have a certain reaction to it. So if something is red, if it would look red to me, say, well, is it red because it looks red to me, or does it look red to me because it's red, right? Now, so no matter what the concept is, once you try to define something in terms of somebody's reaction to it or judgment on it, you've got to face this Euthyphro challenge. So in the case we're talking about here is, if we want to say that moral acts are right or wrong according to whether they're in correlation with God's commandments, we need to ask, does God command these things because they're right, or are they right because he commands them? Or to put it in the negative, does he forbid them because they're wrong, or are they wrong because he forbids them? And this is a difficult dilemma for a divine command theory of the most obvious kind to get around, because if God commands that we do certain things because they are antecedently good and right, then the fact that he commands them doesn't seem to be adding anything, right? They were already good and right before he commanded them. On the other hand, if they aren't antecedently good and right, and he commands them, which makes them good and right, then he could have commanded child abuse instead of taking care of your children, and then you reverse the values on everything. So his commands seem arbitrary, and that seems unacceptable. So it does seem that there's a problem here about which way to go, and there isn't an obvious solution, I think, within this particular, rather crude, as I said, version of what a divine command theory would look like. So here's another version of a divine command theory. Moral requirements are the commandments of a loving God, and obedience to these commandments is not a response to the threats of eternal damnation or eternal bliss. Rather, the reason we have to go along with the commandments of a loving God is that our obedience and submission to these commands is the appropriate response to the love that God has expressed for us in creating the world, and so on. So that's a different version. We're taking the threat business out of it and understanding the relation of God differently. So unlike the threat of divine punishment, love for God and responsiveness to his love for us seems to be the right kind of reason. It passes the dilemma test that I mentioned earlier, right? It's not, on the one hand, it's not like a bribe or a threat, completely unconnected with morality, but on the other hand, it's itself dependent on morality. It seems to get between those two extremes. As far as the Euthyphro question is concerned, the fact that these commandments are commandments of a loving God indicates that there's something to be said for these commandments before he commands them, right? If they're the commandments of a loving God, they're things that he commands out of his love for us, which must mean he commands them because antecedent to his commands, they are in some way good for us. They are commands that are responsive to ways that we have reason to want to live, independent of whether he has commanded them or not. So it comes down, you might say, lands securely on one side of the Euthyphro dilemma. So it seems to get by. So it looks as if this version of divine command theory, you want to call it that, is a coherent way to understand morality, as opposed to the threat version, which seems to me not really coherent for the various reasons that I gave. Now let's look just a moment at this version of morality. First, this supports a broad understanding of morality, which can include not only keeping your promises, not murdering people or stealing from them and so on, but also can include various standards of sexual conduct if God cares about those things. As judging from churches, God has a particularly strong concern with sex. I don't know why he seems to be so interested in this, but he seems to be very interested in that. And if he's interested in it as a loving God as opposed to just a curious or whatever bossy God, it must be because we have some antecedent reason to live one kind of sexual life rather than another. So the scope of morality that would flow from this idea of morality as being founded in God's will and God's love would be a very broad scope, right? It wouldn't be the narrow or liberal conception. So it would be like the kind of morality according to which you might say, well, maybe the law should enforce morality, right? So it would be that broader idea. But even though this view of morality is coherent, this account of morality is coherent, it seems to me to undermine the plausibility of the widespread view that I started off talking about, which is that without God there could be no such thing as morality. But this is one way of understanding what morality is, but is it all plausible to think that it's the only way? And the reason why that ceases to be a very plausible, that claim to exclusivity ceases to be a very plausible claim, has to do with the way this version of divine command theory evaded the Euthyphro problem. Namely, it evaded the Euthyphro problem by saying, well, moral commandments are things that God commands because, antecedent to his commanding, we have reason to want to live that way. Well, if we have reason to want to live that way already, what's God's command adding? We could go directly from the reasons we have to want to live, to keep our promises, to treat our neighbors in a certain way, take care of our children, and even maybe engaging in some kinds of sexual conduct and not others, and so on. If those are all ways that we have reasons to want to live, then okay, as they say, Bob's your uncle. I mean, you can get the conclusion straight from that without going through divine authority. At least that looks like a possibility, right? So the idea that it's only in virtue of divine authority that you're going to get anything like morality doesn't seem so plausible anymore. Now, this is the route that almost all secular versions of moral philosophy have followed. Right? They've started from the reasons that people have to want to treat one another one way or the other, and as it were, gone straight from that to some account of what the content of morality is. And that what they've got to do two things. They've got to explain they've got to say more about, well, what is this idea of being good for us? What are we thinking about when we're thinking about that question in a way that leads to the conclusions about what's morally right? And if our reason for caring about the conclusions we reach by thinking that way isn't that that's a response to God, what is the reason, right? Why should we think about what to do, giving overriding weight to conclusions we would reach by thinking about what's good for us and good for other people within a certain kind of framework? So that's the challenge that a secular view of morality has got to meet. And so what I'm going to do in the next section of this lecture is to give you in a nutshell form my own favored version of a secular account of morality, just as an example. Of course, it's not just an example. Of course, it's the one that's true. But I don't expect you to believe that already. So the view I favor is called contractualism. So according to contractualism, the kind of thinking that we engage in when we're trying to decide whether an action is right or wrong is this: we consider what a principle would be that would permit us to act in this way. And then we ask whether that principle is one that it would be reasonable for somebody in some position relative to that action to reject. And I'm going to give some more content to that. But let's say suppose keeping a promise, right? In order to decide whether it's permissible to break a promise because it turns out to be inconvenient, I consider whether a principle that permitted the breaking of a promise for that kind of reason could be rejected from the point of view of the person who made the promise, from the point of view of the person to whom the promise was made, from the point of view of others who might be affected by what we do. So I promised Omid that I would come to Guelph to give a lecture quite a while ago, and as the date gets closer, as it always happens when you do this, as the date gets closer, the inconvenience of doing this, the fact that what the weather would be like in Guelph, and the fact that I had 3 other deadlines I had to meet, and all these things began to seem, more pressing. So I might have asked myself, would it be all right for me to say, sorry, Omid, I know I promised to do this, but it turns out to be very inconvenient. I'm sure you can find another speaker. Would that be all right or not? So what I do is I consider, if I'm asking, according to contractualism, if I'm asking myself whether it would be okay morally to do that, I consider, well, what kind of reason do I have for rejecting a principle that would require me to keep my promise even though it was inconvenient? And I consider what kind of reason a person in the position of a person to whom a promise is made would have for not accepting that ground for rejecting the principle. A person might say, look, after all, the whole point of promises is to provide us some assurance that you aren't going to reconsider. That's what it's about. And we're interested in that because we have a reason to want to be able to make binding agreements, right? Life would be very inconvenient if we couldn't make any binding agreements. So that's the whole business. And so if mere inconvenience is a way of getting out of binding agreements, then it wouldn't be reasonable for me to reject a principle that required me to keep the promise, because my reason for wanting to get out of it is weaker than the reasons we all have for wanting to be able to rely on the agreements that people have entered into. Right? So there's a piece of contractualist reasoning that's about how we would go. Now I'll come to various parts of this, but what I said is that an act is wrong if any principle that permitted it is one that someone could reasonably reject. So I need to tell you a little bit about what I mean by reasonable rejection. I've already adumbrated it or whatever, but I want to say a little bit more about it. And I have to say two things about it. First, what's the range of reasons that are relevant reasons for the candidate reasons for rejecting a principle, number one. And number two, what does it mean to say that it's reasonable to reject a principle for those reasons? So those are the two crucial elements, and I'll just go over them rather quickly. This is a matter in which there's endless debate and disagreement. But according to my understanding of this, first, the reasons that we consider for rejecting a principle have to be personal reasons. That is, they have to be reasons concerned with how a person's life would be affected if this principle were accepted and people lived by it. So how my life would be affected if any time I made a promise, people could back out of it any time it was inconvenient. Or how my life would be affected if I'm required to keep my promises, no matter how inconvenient it might be. Right? Those are personal reasons because they have to do with, they don't have to do with what's morally right or wrong, they just have to do with what's convenient or inconvenient. What's helpful to me in living my life and in achieving my ends, and what's not helpful to me, right? So the first place, they have to be personal. Second, they can't be moral reasons. That is, they can't be reasons, well, it's reasonable for me to reject this principle because it would be, the acts it permitted would be wrong. That would beg the question, right? Because this is supposed to be an answer to the question about what makes acts wrong, so I can't presuppose it. So it's personal as opposed to moral, and I also think personal as opposed to what I'll call impersonal. That is, we might object to some activities, filling in the Grand Canyon with whatever solid waste because it's such a convenient hole, we don't have to dig one. I think there's a reason not to do that, and it's not just that people wouldn't be able to go there on their vacations, but there's something inappropriate. There's something about the Grand Canyon, something about its grandeur or whatever, which gives me a reason not to spoil it with a lot of tin cans and Coke bottles and whatever else. But that's not a reason. That's not a reason having to do with what I owe to any other individual. That's a reason having to do with the proper responsiveness to the value of the environment or the value of nature. And what I'm talking about here are a kind of morality that has to do with what I owe to other individuals. So the relevant reasons are the reasons having to do with how those other individuals would be affected. Okay, those are the reasons. Then the question of reasonableness, it's reasonable for me to reject a principle if the reason I have for rejecting it is strong enough relative to the reasons that other people would have in other positions for wanting to insist on it. Whether my reasons for wanting to reject the principle that requires me to keep my promise to come to Guelph is a stronger reason, it's a more important thing in my life than the reasons that Omid and other people in his position have for wanting to be able to rely on the promises that people have made to them. And I think it wouldn't be reasonable for me to reject that principle, but it would be reasonable for him to reject a principle that permitted people to back out of promises made to him anytime they found it inconvenient when the time came. So I think it would have been wrong for me to call Omid up or email him as we do now and say, sorry, I can't do it. I won't be there. Okay, so far I've tried to give you a description. I'm sorry I'm talking quickly, but I don't want to go on past 5:30 if I can help it. I'll give you a description of the kind of reasons that I think, according to my view of contractualism, we should think about when we're deciding whether a principle could be rejected or not rejected, and what we mean by saying that it would be reasonable or not reasonable to reject that principle. The idea of reasonableness there is just a perfectly generic idea. When we say, is it reasonable to make this move in chess? Well, that depends upon how likely it is that I'm going to lose my bishop, or how likely it's not. And there are a lot of things I don't know, but the judgment of reasonableness is a judgment about the strength of the available considerations that are before me. And so this judgment is not itself a moral judgment, just a judgment about the relative strength of reasons. It gets its moral content because the question that contractualism tells you to ask is whether it would be reasonable to reject this principle, taking into account the reasons that other people have for insisting on it. Right? So the moral content comes in framing the fact that I have to take other people's interests into account in deciding what to do, and I have to ask whether their reasons are stronger or weaker than my reasons. Okay, so that's the description that contractualism gives of the process of thinking through which I arrive at a conclusion about what's morally permitted or what's not morally permitted. Now, I imagine, although here I'm only speculating, I imagine that that's pretty much, the way I would think of it, is the process that a loving God would go through in deciding which things to command, right? If a loving God's going to decide whether to command that people keep their promises under certain circumstances, as a loving God, he would take into account the needs that human beings, given their circumstances of life, have on being able to make agreements with each other and rely on those agreements, and he would take into account the difficulty that people have in predicting how inconvenient it's going to be to live up to promises that they've kept, and he would make some judgment about this, right? That's what a loving God, I hope, would do. Although I'm not in his position, so I don't know. I can only, as a friend of mine used to say, confronted with any difficult question, you would ask him about this. He would say, "Western man can but speculate." So when it comes to a question of what a loving God would do, I can only speculate. But I imagine that seems to be sort of the right answer. Now, the loving God account of morality, I just suggested that it might agree with my account at the level of describing what kind of thinking goes into deciding which things are right or wrong. But what would remain distinctive about the loving God account of morality would be the answer that it gives to the question, okay, here's a mode of thinking about deciding what to do, but what reason do we have to take that mode of thinking as giving the decisive, overriding answer that we have to go along with, even if it's inconvenient or even dangerous, to go along with that, right? And the answer that the loving God theory gives, well, that's the proper response to the authority of God's love for you, and so on. So the question about contractualism, the next question about contractualism is, what does it offer at that level as an answer, not simply to the question about what are we thinking? What kind of thinking are we doing when we're deciding questions of right and wrong? It's also got to have an answer to the question, why care? Why give authority to the deliverances of that particular kind of thinking? And the answer that contractualism offers is that we have reason to give authority to to the conclusions we reach that way because we have reason to care about whether our actions are or are not justifiable to other people. That our relations of justifiability with other people are something we have important reason to care about and reason to make to allow to override most other questions. So it's not love for God or responsiveness to God's love that supports morality. It's respect for our fellow human beings and desire to have our relations with them be on a footing of mutual justifiability rather than on catch as catch can, seeking advantage, or any one of a number of other things. So this contractualism, you might say, is a thoroughly humanistic doctrine as compared to the divine command alternative. Now, why do I accept this view? I accept it because it seems to me to basically give the right kind of answers to questions about which things are right or wrong. I also accept it because it seems to me to give an answer to the question of why I care about morality that passes the dilemma test, right? It's not reducible to, it's not saying you ought to care about morality because it's morally bad not to respect other people. It says that, look, your relations of justifiability to other people is something that you have a reason to care about, right? And so that reason seems to me to be closely enough connected to morality that it isn't a kind of bribe or threat, but on the other hand, it doesn't simply reduce to because you morally ought to either. So it seems to me to pass that test. It also seems to me to fit with a good account, at least in my experience, of the experience of moral requirements of moral blame and guilt and forgiveness. I think you can all describe what does blame and forgiveness and all those things amount to. I think you can. I wrote another book about this, but I think you can. That there's a plausible account of those things. I'll just give one example, which I've given, and some of you, if you've looked at the book in which I've argued for this, will be familiar with this. But it seems to me that this account of what moral wrongness consists in, namely consists in acting on principles that we couldn't justify to other people, fits with the experience one has when one first reads something like Peter Singer's famous article on famine. I don't know, I'm sure many of you have read this article, written in the 1970s, when he said, imagine that you're walking by a pond and there's a child drowning, and it would be a little inconvenient for you to go in and save the child, or you could just walk on. Surely you've got to walk in and save the child. But then here's another case. There's a child who's starving in that year, I think it was Bangladesh, although every year there's people starving somewhere. And if you send $5, you could save this child from starving rather than buy a latte or whatever you might buy, and it would be morally wrong for you not to do that, and Singer says it continues to be morally wrong even if the cost of that you're going to sacrifice keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger, as long as it isn't as bad as what the child is going to suffer. So that's a very powerful claim, and it's very powerful because what we'd have to do to live up to that set of moral requirements is extremely scary. Nonetheless, almost everybody I know who's read this, and most of the students in the classes where I've taught this, and I myself feel challenged by it. I feel when I hear this thing, I feel awful about this. So the question is, what's the content of that feeling of awfulness that you have? Now, it might be just, and Singer sometimes suggests this, he's a utilitarian, so he thinks the foundation of morality has to do with the promotion of the greatest amount of good, so you'd produce more good by sending the $5 to save the child than by spending it on a latte or saving it up to buy new sneakers or something. But it doesn't seem to me that corresponds to the way one would feel bad. I think the badness that I feel is I couldn't justify it to that child. What could I say to the child or her parents, to say, I realize I could have saved your child, but, that seems, so this feeling of, you might say, alienation from other fellow creatures that one feels when one realizes that one's behaving in a way that one couldn't justify to them, that seems to me to be the essence of guilt that lies behind morality. Now, it's a further question of whether Singer is right, or whether that any time we don't keep sending our money until we've reduced ourselves to a situation where we're just as badly off as they are. I don't think that's true, but that's a substantive question about the content of morality, right? But I'm saying that I think that the sting one feels when one reads that is accurately captured by this answer to the question of why is morality something that you might care about. Now, returning now back to the discussion of law and morality, the account of morality that contractualism offers seems to fit with the narrower idea of morality. That it seems to fit with the idea of morality that underlies, let's say, human rights to due process, sufficient food, maybe privacy, freedom of expression, and all those other things, and supports the idea that morality, that law shouldn't be the enforcer of morality, because the idea of morality that the law would be enforcing isn't part of morality, isn't part of morality as this understood. That it is all right for the law to enforce what we owe to each other, but it's not all right for the law to enforce sexual conduct or what we do in private in various other, how we dress or other kinds of ways. In fact, that's even, in this understanding of moral, it's morally impermissible for the law to do that. That is, according to contractualism, a justifiable constitution, that is, a constitution such that it would be wrong for us not to go along with, on the whole, not to go along with the laws that are enacted under that constitution, in order for a principle requiring us to go along with a certain constitution to be one that it wouldn't be reasonable for us to reject, it has to be a constitution that incorporates things like due process, freedom of speech, and all those other things. So I think this idea of morality explains that component, that side of the philosophy of law idea, but it leaves out in the cold the idea of morality that we're referring to when we say the law shouldn't enforce morality. So it seems that this supports the narrow idea of morality that was taught in the courses that I mentioned at the beginning, the one that has nothing to do with sex, as opposed to the broader idea of morality that includes sexual conduct. So the last part of my lecture, I think I'm going to make it here. The last part of my lecture, I'm going to ask: is that really right? Is it really right that morality, in fact, does have nothing to do with sex? Many people feel that this is a mistaken doctrine, and I want to say that they're partly right. That is to say, is sex really not a moral matter at all? And I want to say, well, that depends, as Bill Clinton might have said. It depends on what you mean by morality. So the next part of the story is about that. So sex isn't the only thing, I think, that's commonly referred to as moral, which this contractualist account of morality leaves out of the sphere of morality. For example, I think it's a moral fault not to be a loving parent or not to be a loyal friend. But this isn't because it would be reasonable to reject principles that it wouldn't be reasonable to reject principles that would require it or require this, because this idea of reasonable rejection has to do with what we owe to everybody, strangers or not. Whereas being a loyal friend or being a parent consists in caring about my relation with my friend or with my children. And that's a much more specific thing than this very abstract idea of what I could justify to the child in Bangladesh or to anybody else in the world. So I think that if it's morally wrong to not be a loyal and caring parent, it's not like, well, I caused this creature to exist, and I should have known when I caused it to exist that it wouldn't be able to get along in the world without my help, so I'm obligated to help it. So it's like if I drop somebody off in the desert and I know that they can't get along unless I bring them water, I'm obligated to bring them water. So my reason for taking care of my children isn't like that, right? So it's much more specific. So that falls outside. The value of these particular relationships, which we have good reason to want to live up to, is a different and more specific thing, which plausibly called moral, but it's a different kind of I think we're using morality in a slightly different sense. I also think that it's a serious fault to be bone dead lazy and not be willing to work and not take any interest in developing your skills and talents or anything. You just want to lie around on the couch all day. I once heard Ronald Dworkin give a lecture in Italy where there was simultaneous translation going on. There was a booth up on the stage where they were doing the simultaneous translation, and he was talking about what made a good life. And he said, it's better to live a life in which of striving for achievements, even if you fail, than to be a couch potato. And then a huge amount of laughter developed in the translation booth while the translators tried to figure out what the Italian for couch potato was. But so it's a moral fault to be, I think, it's a fault plausibly called moral to be a couch potato, not because we owe it to other people to do our share. Maybe that's a fault too, but I think it's just a failing. It's a failure of a different kind. So let's look at that and see kind of what does that fault consist in? Well, I think it's a fault which fails. It's a valuational error. It's a fault that involves a failure to be sensitive to the reasons one has to try to do things that involve developed skills, or to achieve accomplishments, to prove theorems, or to find the vaccine that stops some disease, or there are all kinds of things we have reason to do, and they require an investment of time and effort. And we have reason even to try to do those things, even if we don't do them. Trying to do them is something we have reason to do, simply because they're, I think, intrinsically worth doing. I believe that anyway. Now, I think many people might think I was being moralistic in saying that, but I believe that. But I think it's less commonly recognized that it's also a fault of exactly the same kind to be overly concerned with work and accomplishment. to be a workaholic of a certain kind, who thinks that the advancement of his or her career is the only thing really worth caring about, or that being a person who's the first person to get to the office and the last person to leave is a really important kind of thing. That's nuts, right? And that's a fault of exactly this. It's just the other side of this fault. Now, let's look at this kind of a fault. I think that's a fault of evaluation. That is, it's a failure to understand that work has a kind of, an accomplishment and striving for accomplishment has a kind of value, which the lazy person, the couch potato, is failing to notice. You see that, but you understand that positive value in an exaggerated way. And you give it a role in crowding out everything else in your life, taking care of your family, enjoying yourself, and so on, in a destructive way. A lot of people do this. But that's not part of the morality that contractualism describes. But it can lead you to act badly and to do things that are morally wrong in the way that narrow morality describes, such as to abuse your coworkers or your underlings, to try to force them, to exploit them so that you can succeed more, force them to work longer hours in the lab so that you can win the Nobel Prize or whatever, or exploit them in various ways, and maybe to cheat on your competitors, hide their lab notes, and steal their ideas or whatever. So an excess overvaluing work and accomplishment can lead you to fail to recognize other independent values like family life. It can also lead you to violate morality in the narrow sense, even though those errors are, so to speak, downstream from a more fundamental error, which just consists in having the wrong idea about what's valuable about work and development of skills and accomplishment and success. So having that distorted idea leads you to behave in a way that's morally wrong. It also is incompatible, it distorts and is incompatible with the kind of relations that you want to have with other people. Friendship, marriage, cooperation with your coworkers and the people who work with you in the lab, and so on. Okay, is this underlying fault, this misvaluation, properly called a moral fault? Well, I don't think the answer to that question matters. I think it may be commonly called a moral fault. People maybe call it a moral fault because it's a fault that consists in failing to respond to something which isn't a matter of what you enjoy, or isn't a subjective matter, right? So people think that if there's subjective reasons we have, and then there's the reasons that aren't merely subjective, and those are all moral reasons. That seems to me to be not a very helpful way of looking at it, but I think that's one reason why people might call these things moral. Maybe they call these reasons moral just because they're part of the Ten Commandments or something like that. That would be another sociological explanation. But I do think it's worth noting whether it makes sense to call these reasons for example, respecting the value of work in the right way, whether it makes sense to call them moral or not. I think it's important, one, to recognize that they exist and are real, and second, to recognize that they're distinct from the reasons we have to care about morality in the narrow sense. That is, the reasons not to murder people, break your promises, lie to them, and things like that. So morality, as we commonly use the term, has a multiplicity of normative foundations, or reasons why we should take it seriously. So I think that's true. Okay. Now, one final thing that this brings out is that not everything that counts as moral in this broad sense that I'm now allowing, which counts failing to live up to the value of work, or the value of family, as well as being able to justify yourself to others, that broad category. Not everything. If all of that counts as morality, then morality as a whole doesn't simply consist in requirements or prohibitions. The requirements of what we owe to each other is understood in terms of principles, which are requirements or permissions and so on. But the morality of work is a matter of responding correctly to a certain value. It isn't the case, if there is such a thing as the morality of work, it doesn't consist in prohibitions like thou shalt not work on certain days of the week, or one must never cut wood with your left hand, or with the same saw that you use to cut something else. I mean, that it's not a matter of prohibition, but that doesn't mean it isn't moral in this broad sense. That seems to me to be a point worth noting. All right, so now I'm sure that you've all seen where I'm headed in my conclusion, which is that morally speaking, sex is like work. So that's the bumper sticker, right? That is, insofar as there is such a thing as sexual morality that goes beyond duties not to use force or violence, duties to keep your promises, duties not to exploit your power over people, and so on, and covers the actual conduct of the practice, insofar as there are moral considerations that apply there, they don't consist in prohibitions or requirements, but rather in valuing sexual relations with and sexual attractiveness of other people in the right way, seeing that it has a value, but not giving it the wrong kind of value or too much value. And it seems to me, now I'm going to get really moralistic here, it seems to me that the most fundamental problem of sexual morality, at least in the United States, I'm sure things are much better in Canada, leaving aside sexual discrimination, which is a legal and a question of what we owe to each other in that sense, but going beyond that, the most fundamental problem of sexual morality doesn't have to do with homosexuality or gay marriage or masturbation or any of those things that the Pope disapproves of, but they have to do with the fact that everything in our society, all the films, all the advertisements, encourage people to give a kind of importance to sex and sexual attractiveness, which is exaggerated and distorted, just like the kind of attitude toward work that I was describing could be exaggerated and distorted, which is mistaken in its own right, number one. Number two, gets in the way of other values, that is, it prevents you from having the right kind of relations with other human beings. And third, leads people to violate the most basic requirements of not using violence or against other people, such as their sexual partners or their sexual rivals, and so on. So I think all those ills are ills in morality in the narrow sense, but they flow from a more basic misvaluation of how we should understand the value of that particular dimension of life. Now, I started off being rather hostile to the people who think that morality has to do with sex, and now I've come around to agreeing with them, and I think probably the Pope and various other people would agree with what I just said about what's wrong with American society in this dimension, and I'm up to a point I'm happy to acknowledge my agreement with them, and I hope it might make them more willing to accept my view of morality, although I doubt that would be true. But I do want to temper this agreement with a couple of cautionary notes. First is, although I regret and lament the effects of advertising and some forms of entertainment on the values that are predominant in my society about having to do with sex and the value of sexual attractiveness and how one should dress and so on, I'm a firm believer in freedom of expression, and I would fight against any attempt by a government to regulate forms of expression or forms of dress in order to get people to come in line with this. I think that's not something that within the morality of what we owe to each other, a government that claims that authority couldn't be legitimate. So I'm a person who believes in tolerance. If you've read my essay on tolerance, who believes in tolerance but feels that I suffer every day from the consequences of it in a way. That is that in my society, religion has a dominance that I regret. Sexual attractiveness has a dominance that I regret, but that's all just the result of the interplay of argument and dialogue within the society. And if you want to live in a free society, if you want to have the right kind of relations with your fellow citizens, respecting them as separate autonomous creatures, then you got to live with the consequences, right? But that doesn't mean you can't regret. You can't wish sometimes that the consequences were otherwise. Michael, I think, given that I said I thought it was a bad thing that people are encouraged to value sex in a certain way and to you might say, dress in ways that advertise their sexuality in certain ways, I don't want to say that this puts me in bed with the Taliban or other religious leaders who want to cause women to be covered up all the time or not allow them to leave the home and so on. I don't believe that. On the contrary, it seems to me that those views are mistaken in exactly the same way that the predominant view about sex in my country is mistaken. That is, it results from placing an exaggerated importance on sex and controlling sex and the relations between the sexes. It's a different error, but it's a valuational error of exactly the same sort. So the fact that I think that there are some things that are wrong about giving sex an exaggerated form doesn't mean that I agree with agree with that. Okay, now, if I think I may have to stop there. Although I had a further thing that I was going to say, but I think that I will forego it, and no doubt it will come up in the discussion. So I've considered the question of why we should care about morality. I've considered a couple of alternatives. I've tried to argue for mine and to argue for kind of pluralism about morality as we normally use the term. So thank you very much for your patience. I'll do it.
So if you have any questions, raise your hand and please speak up so that everybody hears you.
So,
Wonderful talk. Very clear, very precise.
you have to be louder. I'm deaf. I'm old enough that I can.
I had this written in advance, so I apologize. I had written this question in advance. I apologize for being clear. I think you pretty much outlined all the kind of nuances and inconsistencies and problems with the banking perspectives of how things are being addressed in the world.
I don't think I'm the only person who's not hearing this. Is that right? So you got to project. Use your diaphragm and.
Locution.
That's right.
I'm going to note that I'm going to ask a question from somewhat of a pacifist perspective.
From a what perspective?
Kind of primarily a pacifist perspective. Now, there are problems with that, but
I still haven't got the word.
Pacifist.
pacifist.
Pacifist perspective. Oh, okay. All right. Good.
Before I start my question, I'd like to recite a quote from Martin Niemöller, I believe, a Protestant pastor who spoke out against Hitler. First it came to the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came to trade unions, I did not speak out because I was a trade unionist. So this is the quote from Martin Niemöller, a Protestant pastor who spoke out against Hitler and the Nazi movement. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one to speak for me. In my act of quoting this, I observe some fallacies I have employed. Appeal to authority, appeal to fear, and appeal to emotion. Though the quote symbolizes, I will note that I'm making a sort of a polemic claim, which is strictly not an argument employing critical thinking, but rather a reaction to undesirable events. But there is a point made in understanding that there is a problem throughout history, and even today, where there's marginalization, stereotyping, and stigmatization, as you actually mentioned in your lecture there, that occurred as fallacies due to non-rational thinking. The Holocaust, concentration camps, insane asylums and mental institutions during the Victorian era, and the impacts of residential schooling system in Canada used on Indigenous youth are some examples. There appears in these cases to be a kind of a brute force approach when that was considered to be kind of morally understood. So there should be examples where philosophical arguments have been kind of skewed to support a sort of extremist thinking, which use other fallacies like argumentum ad factum and argumentum ad absurdum to support the claims. So from your research, from what you've already described, is there a clear, understandable way to avoid these acts of extremism which may fail to use philosophical arguments properly to determine whether the acts are actually moral, right, or wrong? And yes, I realize this is an overly large and overloaded question.
There are two parts to your question, as I understand it. Is this working?
I don't think so, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, I understand two parts to your question. One is, how do we reach the conclusion that some of the practices that you mentioned are morally wrong? And the second is, I think, if I understand the question right, how could one bring it about that this wrongness is more widely recognized and that its wrongness has the right kind of motivational effect, so that people won't any longer say, well, they're only taking up the socialists, so what's that to me, right? So those are two questions. One of them is a normative question of political philosophy. The other is a question about social change. I've tried to answer the first question. I think that, look, if people think about morality as being fundamentally a set of principles that apply to them because they are the principles of their group, and thereby favor their group. They have to do with being loyal to the other non-socialists or to the members of their particular religion or whatever. If you look at, and there are views out there that hold that morality really has to have its basis in a kind of group identity or a group loyalty. I'm very much opposed to views of that kind, and so my idea of justifiability to others is justifiability to anybody who has the capacity to understand reasons, and that's a very demanding requirement, but nonetheless, it seems to me, once I focus on it, when I think about that child in Bangladesh, the idea of what can I justify to her makes as much sense as what could I justify to my fellow Catholic, my fellow non-socialist, or whatever it might be living close by. So I try to propose a view that is universalistic in that sense, and then why should anybody care about it? I think, well, people care about it insofar as they can be made to feel imaginatively through an exercise of, we might say, moral imagination, imagined, envisioned dialogue with that person, right? Now, that's just a question of what the reason is that people might recognize, what would make these actions wrong, and what kind of thinking, if they went through it, might motivate them to stand up for the socialists and so on. But the further question, the second part of your question, was how to bring it about that the morality that people actually accept, you might say the mores that people actually accept, are more universalistic in this way. And the answer to that question is, of course, that I don't know. I'm not even a sociologist, let alone a person who understands how social change is brought about. But I'll venture a couple of remarks. One is a somewhat optimistic one. That is, it seems to me if you look back over the last 3 centuries, I believe that across the world there has been a great broadening of the range of people who are standardly included within the scope of everybody. That is, slaves aren't excluded, people in the Orient aren't excluded. So I think that, and it's also been an expansion in the number of people who hold something like that universalistic view. Doesn't mean they always act on it. It doesn't mean that everywhere it's taken hold. But I think that one of the greatest form of moral progress over the last centuries has been the broadening of morality in those two senses. That is, the broadening of the number of people who share it, and the broadening of the scope of universality that forms its content. But that's just optimistic, whatever, up to a point. We're not there. Second question, I'll be really quick about this, is what drives that? And here I think that what drives, this is just real speculation. Western man can but speculate. Two suggestions. One is, the first a precondition is to be made vividly aware of how other people are affected. And in this case, the spread of media throughout the world has been a big advantage. Right? If I see the conditions under which people are living in refugee camps and so on my television every night, it makes me less able to simply say, I don't care about that. And the other is the greater realization that I rely on other people's voluntary cooperation in institutions that I depend on. The world commerce that I depend upon, where the products I buy come from, depends on people being willing to work in the factories, obey the laws of property within my own country and outside it. And if I feel threatened to the degree that I feel threatened by their disaffection and by their strikes, by their militancy against the terms of cooperation, then that gives me, you might say, a not wholly moral, but nonetheless psychologically effective reason for wanting to think that I could offer them good terms for cooperating, right? So I think both awareness on the one hand and an awareness of one's vulnerability on the other are the two main drivers, but they haven't got us home yet.
It kind of relates to my question. Immanuel Kant would say, what ought I to do? At what point in time, Professor, do I care more about you than I care about myself? Is it like presupposing shame? Like, I better not do it because I wouldn't want it to be done to me. So then at what point in time do I care more about me than you?
That's right, very clear.
I'm kind of struggle. You're drowning, I'm drowning. Do I save you or me?
Well, That's a toughie. And the question is, would it be reasonable to reject a principle that allowed you to save yourself rather than a stranger? And I think no, it wouldn't. I think it's permissible to save yourself rather than a stranger. I think that's a level of universality concern that can't be required of everybody. So I think now, whether it's all right for you to save yourself rather than 15 strangers or a million, then we're looking at something tough. But also it depends on kind of what the mechanism is through which you might be able to save people. So I think that's a question about moral content. But the further question, which doesn't have to do with the content of morality, but why get into the game of thinking about morality at all? Now, the fact that I wouldn't want that done to me is already a move within the game, because when I'm trying to decide in my terms whether it be reasonable for me to reject this principle, which would impose that cost on him, asking how I would feel if that were done to me is one of the ways of making vividly aware what the reason is that's opposed to my reason of convenience. So if I ask, am I going to default on my promise to Omid, I have to say, well, how would I like it? But that's just, doesn't matter. That's just a way of my making vivid what the cost on the other side is. But that's not a thought that's going to get me into the game unless I already care about the justifiability of how I treat Omid. And I think that's a further question. And one question is why, the question I was addressing in response to the first question is, how can we get people to get more into the stage of caring about whether the way they treat other people is in fact justifiable to them. And I said, well, greater awareness on the one hand and greater awareness of one's vulnerability to their willingness to cooperate on the other seem to me to be the two main levers.
Question at the very end.
Yes.
No, Karen, the person behind you. Yeah, you said.
Thank you very much for the talk. Carter, you mentioned reasonableness as a part of understanding and recognizing principles. Does this not further beg the question that there's a criterion or set of criteria to determine what is reasonable, and then it becomes an epistemic matter, how do we determine what's reasonable? Second part of the question then is, if this is a hard deterministic universe, we're essentially meat puppets. Does morality go out the window then? We got to figure out a way to determine what might be called optimal functionality for us as biological organisms.
Okay, let's see, the first question, I want to say there's no general rule that you can follow, no algorithm or sort of decision procedure which settles what's reasonable. To decide whether it's reasonable is to ask whether a certain reason is or is not stronger than another reason. And I think we make judgments of that kind all the time. It's not an unfamiliar...
So is it arbitrary then?
No, it's not arbitrary. It's not an unfamiliar kind of reason. So what I want to say is, look, do I have a better reason to take the bishop or to sacrifice my pawn over here? Well, that depends upon how each one of them affects my odds of winning the match, right? And so I have to decide I make a judgment about which one of those reasons is stronger. So that's within the context, not necessarily of self-interest exactly, but within the context of a certain objective, right? Now, but it's a judgment of the same kind about comparing the strength of reasons for action. Now, what's distinctive, I think, about the judgments we make when we're deciding whether it's reasonable to reject a moral principle, what makes that decision a moral decision doesn't have to do with the content of the idea of reasonableness, but has to do with which reasons we consider as candidates. So the fact that I'm considering not just my inconvenience, but also the cost to somebody else. What the moral frame does is to require me to consider those reasons as opposing reasons, and then make a judgment of reasonableness about it. There's no general rule, there's no epistemic formula for doing that, but I think that judgment about relative strength of reasons is a common garden variety kind of judgment that pervades practical life. Okay, so what's special about moral thinking is that we are required morally to consider certain candidate reasons and take them to be opposed, as opposed to just not caring about how other people are inconvenienced. Now, about free will, I'm a compatibilist. I think that the problem of free will is overrated, and there isn't really any such problem. That our moral blame of other people depends upon what they are actually like, and what motivation actually led them to do what they did. Whether they were caused to do it or whether they were caused to be like that Doesn't matter. I'm not. I know that an argument is required for that, but I'm just telling you that's where I stand about that. If you come to the philosophy department colloquium tomorrow afternoon, you'll hear a little bit more, but not enough to convince you, I'm sure.
Okay, Karen?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. I thought it was fantastic. And I was just going to push you on something that came to mind and wonder if you might want to add or if it might prompt the adding of another kind of moral fault. So what came to mind is that there seem to be some situations, lived situations, maybe rare, where using arguments or drawing upon reasons or even offering reasons seems to me to be a kind of moral infraction. And the example that I had in mind is, say somebody dies a young death from some natural cause, there's some kind of moral obligation or something that ought to be done. And it seems to me that starting to talk about the reasons involved would be to exactly not be taking the right approach to that situation, to invoke reason giving or to bring arguments into that context maybe too quickly seems to be exactly the wrong kind of thing to be reaching for.
Right.
Then I was thinking about the list of moral faults, and I like that list, and you talked about failure to be sensitive to certain reasons. And I wondered if there's a possibility that in some situations a fault could be a failure to be sensitive to the reasons for not offering reasons.
Sure, but being sensitive to reasons and consciously offering them are two different things. So if I have to ask, should I save my wife from the burning building or the stranger, then there's already something gone wrong. As Bernard Williams famously said, I've already had one thought too many. But if you ask me, would it be all right for someone to save his wife rather than a stranger from a burning building? Obviously the answer is yes, and I can give you the story about why that is true. Because a set of principles that required people to be impartial always between their loved ones and strangers would be a set of principles that required you to live in such a way that you couldn't have loved ones. And life would be completely unlivable. But a person shouldn't need to go through that thinking at the time, right? It ought to be automatic. So the question of what makes something right is one question. The question of what kind of thinking should a person be engaging in when they're presented with the choice about whether to do it or not is something else. So I agree with you that there could be, I don't know, not that it was morally wrong to ask for reasons, but that asking for reasons would show a kind of moral obtuseness or a kind of personal obtuseness about I don't have the right kind of feelings for my wife if I go into this moral deliberation when I'm presented with this opportunity.
Thank you so much for coming out. I just had a quick question, and it came about as a result of your discussion through the morality and trying to create almost an adversarial system between the reasonings of others and the reasonings of our own. And I got a little caught up on when I'm about potential moral situations where I'm dealing with non-rational individuals, like, for example, like my treatment of animals, say, or even treatment of very, very small children that have no capacity to provide me reasons.
Right. Yep.
How then do I engage them in a moral framework?
Okay, good. That's a famously tough question, a question which raises a famously tough issue for this view. Small children are relatively easy, because small children actually aren't a special kind of creature. Being a small child is a stage within a human life, and one of the things we owe to people is to give them particular care in periods of their life when they need that care. So I think that comes with the package. But the question about the morality of treatment of animals is more difficult. I do want to say that this idea of being moved by the justifiability of your actions to others is a question that really makes sense only when those others are creatures to whom the idea of justifiability makes sense, and that, I think, requires that they be the kind of creature that in principle could understand what reasons one has. And cattle and tigers and other snakes and other wild animals don't have that capacity. But nonetheless, it's not morally okay to treat them just any old way. And so, what should we say about that? Well, one thing to say about that is to invoke the pluralism about morality that I mentioned, where I said, look, not everything that's plausible to call moral falls within the purview of what we owe to other people with whom we can stand in relations of justifiability. So, as Bentham said about animals, said the question isn't whether they can reason or speak, the question is whether they can suffer. And the answer might be that suffering is the suffering of a conscious creature is bad. And I'm not responding correctly to that disvalue if I'm indifferent to it. So it might be that our relation to animals simply is that there's a disvalue in their suffering, and it's a fault in us if we aren't responsive to that. Now, whether you want to call that moral or not, that's like the other questions I mentioned about whether it's not a morality of principles exactly, but it's a matter of responding rightly to reasons that are there. That seems to me to be the right way to look at it, but not everybody finds that satisfying. Some people think, no, that somehow mistreating animals is wrong in just the same sense that mistreating other human beings is wrong. And I don't myself exactly hold that view, but I can see I feel the pull of it, and this is my attempt to fend it off.
Yes, Josh?
I was just going to ask a really quick question about, you mentioned right at the end of your presentation, the idea of that you're very supportive of freedom of expression. I was just curious because you mentioned you come from the United States. In Canada, it's very different. The idea, they draw the line, you've also talked about the distinction between morality and law. How in Canada holds a much more paternalistic view of what is hate crime or hate speech.
Right.
So I was just curious, at what point does your theory draw the line between when it's freedom of expression or when you're actually negatively impacting someone or doing what would be considered hate speech?
Good question. So I devoted many years of my life in the earlier stages to thinking about freedom of expression, and I'm a kind of free speech junkie, and I'm inclined to take a rather hard line. I would take the below the border line about that hate speech legislation is not constitutional, although I do find it pressing. So the way I understand it is this, that freedom of expression, the so-called right of freedom of expression is a set of constraints. To believe in freedom of expression, to believe in a set of constraints on the powers that governments can have to regulate expression compatible with other important values. So if I think that the government had the power to ban various kinds of political speech they disagreed with, that this would make it impossible to actually have democratic politics, and if the government had the power to ban other things that they disagreed with, then people wouldn't be able to engage in a process of deciding how to live, and then they would be deprived of opportunities to think themselves and also opportunities to try to convince other people. So the question about hate speech is a constitutional principle that allows governments to ban speech because it casts disrepute on members of certain ethnic groups. Is that a power? Is that power a power that is benign, or is it a power that's dangerous? That is it a power that if government has that, they're likely to use it in a way that we have reason to object to? And I'm inclined to think that is true. That it is, although it requires biting the bullet and saying it's okay that people suffer these things. Not that it isn't painful, but there are other ways of redressing that. There are other kinds of government programs, for example, that can speak out in favor of the standing of members of minority groups. There's all kinds of policy measures that can be taken to bolster their standing as legitimate citizens, protect their voting rights, protect their public speech rights, and enforce hate crime laws. That is, laws of actually beating people up because they're members of groups. All that's not. Doesn't fall under hate speech in my view. So there are all kinds of things that government can do to try to block and protect people against these harms while allowing people to raise the political question of whether we should have more immigration or not. I mean, I think that people who engage in arguments against immigration are often engaged in denigrating the standing of immigrant groups in a way that is wrong and morally objectionable and so on. But once you start allowing the debate about immigration policy to be regulated on grounds that it's wrong, then it's hard to see exactly where the power of government is going to be limited. So that's what I think on that question. Now, it is to a certain extent an empirical question. If a government has this power, would it be used in a way that's dangerous? On the one hand, and to what degree would it actually make people in the groups that we all want to protect, importantly, better off? And so to a certain degree, we have natural laboratories, although it's hard to make cross-cultural comparisons. We have Canada and the United States, and you've got, I forget exactly what the formula is, laws against incitement. In Britain, I think it's law against incitement to racial hatred. And Britain is a more different society from the United States than Canada is, but we're both quite different. So you could ask, are race relations and relations between the dominant original settling groups and the more recent immigrant groups better? Is the standing of the latter groups better in Canada and the UK than in the United States? And the answer seems to me that it's not obvious that it is. But then, on the other hand, from the point of view of free speech junkies, I have to answer the question, has the sky fallen? Right? Has the government taken away all our rights? I mean, maybe defenders of what we call the First Amendment are no better than defenders of what's called the Second Amendment, which, the National Rifle Association says, as soon as you can take away one gun, they're going to come into our houses, and so maybe my worry that it's dangerous to have the power of government to regulate speech about inciting racial hatred is no better than the paranoid, as I would think of it, propaganda of the National Rifle Association in the United States. Well, I can't say that the sky has fallen in Canada. You still have pretty good democratic politics, and similarly in the UK. Although I do think that in the UK, at least, there's a more general the willingness to allow laws against hate speech goes along with having an Official Secrets Act and having other restrictions on political speech, which I think actually have had a deleterious effect. So maybe this is guilt by association. So I think there's a question there, and I admit that although I tend to come down on the side of thinking that hate speech laws are not a good thing for the reasons I mentioned, I don't think it's a clearly obvious case. I wouldn't think it would be a really terrible thing if the Supreme Court in my country were to decide that hate speech laws were all right after all. I think we could probably live with it, but I'm sort of suspicious of them for that reason.
Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. For those people who are interested to continue their conversation with Dr. Scanlon, we are going to Bowling. Please feel free to join us and join me in thanking Dr. Scanlon.